Welcome to this webinar where we will present findings from the third annual Biodiversity Concerns Survey, which is a representative survey of 3,500 Australians, which has explored their attitudes to a range of biodiversity issues. I'll start by acknowledging the First Peoples of the lands and waters of Australia and pay my respect to elders past and present. The Biodiversity Council expresses gratitude for the long and ongoing custodianship of country by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I'm joining from Turrbal and Yugara country in Meanjin or Brisbane, and you can use the chat to let us know where you are joining from. So the Biodiversity Concerns Survey is undertaken for the Biodiversity Council each year by a team of social scientists at Monash University with input from 4 other universities. The findings help to guide our work and are also a resource for researchers, policymakers, and nature advocates across the country. It's been really great to see many groups already citing the findings from the recent survey and the previous ones. And the report is available on the Biodiversity Council website if you haven't already seen it. And it's been great to see the strong interest in this webinar with over 350 people registering in just a week. So if any of the findings resonate for you and your work, we would love to know about how you might use them. And you're welcome to send me an email after the webinar. You can easily find my email on the Biodiversity Council website, or you can post into the chat. So we'll have 3 speakers today, followed by a Q&A session. Our first speaker will be Dr. Meghan Shaw from Monash University's BehaviourWorks Australia team, who conducted the survey, and who will present results on how Australians connect with nature, the biodiversity issues they are concerned about, and the conservation actions they are taking. Our second speaker is Lis Ashby, the Policy and Innovation Lead at the Biodiversity Council, who will outline findings on how nature will influence voting intentions in the upcoming election and which nature policies Australians support. And our final speaker today will be Associate Professor Angela Dean from the University of Queensland, who will present insights from her research on how we can better engage people with nature and its conservation. If you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A function, which is not actually the same as the chat. You can use the chat and the Q&A separately. We're going to save all the questions till after the talks, when we'll have around 20 minutes for Q&A. So I'd like to kick off by introducing Dr. Meghan Shaw from BehaviourWorks Australia at Monash University. Meghan is a research fellow where she applies social science methods and behavioural science approaches to address environmental and social challenges. Over to you, Meghan.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. So as Yana said, hi, my name is Meg. And I am part of a much bigger team. So I just want to share, first of all, and shout out a few of the other people who are involved in this. Firstly, a huge shout out to my colleague, Lis Ashby, who has done a lot of the work behind the scenes, preparing the survey and everything. And then everybody else here down below where it says on behalf of, a big shout out to them for all of the help and support. All right, so I'm based in Melbourne. Currently, I'm at Monash Clayton campus. So I'm streaming to you live from the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people. So I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on. And just a little bit of a brief overview about BehaviourWorks. So BehaviourWorks is the organisation that I work for. Basically, BehaviourWorks is part of Monash University, or more specifically, something called Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And we are sort of like half research, half consultancy. We do a lot of behaviour change research, employing a lot of PhD qualified staff members, and complete a range of projects around everything from behaviour change in health to behaviour change in the environment, which is where this comes in. So just wanted to share a little bit about that, and I'm sure you can go to our website to find a little bit more about BehaviourWorks. First of all, Biodiversity Concerns Survey is a representative survey, as Yana was talking about. What that means is it's demographically representative. So that's things like gender, age, location, so where people are from. And we use that based on the ABS data, the Australian Bureau of Statistics data that comes from our censuses. So it means that the people who are doing this survey are representative of what the picture of Australians look like. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about that came out of the survey was information on where Australians are actually getting their information on nature from. So this is a list of all of the different sort of information sources that we ask people about. And you can see here that the most popular are things like news and documentaries. That's been pretty consistent over the 3 years that we've run this survey, that people are getting their information on nature from news sources. This could be physical newspapers, could be news on social media, could be news on the web, and documentaries as well. But we're seeing that there's actually quite a lot of change in some of the other sources that people are getting their information on nature from. So, as I said, Australians mainly use news sources and documentaries, but we're finding that there's less of a reliance on things like government websites. So from last year, there's been a drop of 4% in the amount of people who are using government websites, for example, as a source of information. And in fact, what we're actually seeing is use of things like friends and family. So that's been a 10% increase in people using friends and family as a source of information. Local environment and community groups, so community leaders, and environmental advocacy organizations. So an increase in the amount of people using those as information sources about nature. One of the other findings that we had from the survey is sort of this picture of how Australians feel emotionally connected to nature. And so in the report, if you have a look at the report, it will show a list of different what we call survey items. They're basically questions we ask people that capture a sense of feeling emotionally connected to the nature around them. In the actual Biodiversity Concerns Survey, that's based on some work that was done by my colleague Mel Hattie, but it's been a little bit changed, just sort of be a little bit more accurate for today. It doesn't exactly matter what these items are, but what I want to point out is that for the questions that are here, even the one that has the lowest level of agreement, and I put that in quotation marks because even that question has 69% agreement. So basically what we can take away from this is that at least 69% of Australians feel connected to the nature around them and the nature in Australia in some way. If we have a look at what some of these things do measure, we can see these bottom 3 items here. So I like to get outdoors whenever I get the chance. I enjoy spending time in nature, and being in nature helps me deal with everyday stress. They're very highly supported, but they're showing that the connection that Australians feel to nature is often around being able to spend time in nature. And you might hear a little bit about that from Ange later on. The highest level of agreement that we found in terms of connection to nature was around this feeling that Australians want nature to be looked after. So 88% of Australians agreed or strongly agree that it's important that they know that nature in Australia is looked after. We also know that Australians are currently quite concerned about both the current state of nature, but also the future state of nature as well. So how it might be doing in the years to come. So if we look at people's concern about the loss of plants and animals in their local area, we can find that 86% of people are at least slightly concerned about that. We measured concern about a whole range of different biodiversity issues that are pretty relevant and current at the moment. If you want to have a look at these in a lot of detail, I will direct you to the report because there's some really interesting stuff in there. But what I wanted to point out here that is even the one that people are the least concerned about, again in quotation marks, is still at 84%. So 84% of people are still at least slightly concerned about a range of different biodiversity issues and things that are impacting nature currently and in the future. The key sort of things that people were concerned about were these top 3 here. So the first one is increasing levels of waste and pollution. I should have added it in the environment. So the impacts of waste and pollution on the actual environment, with 97% of people concerned about that. 96% of people are concerned about the possible extinction of native animals. In Australia, we're obviously very lucky to have a range of iconic species that you can't find anywhere else in the world, and we have a really strong sense of pride about those species and feel a sort of sense of stewardship to look after that. So this finding here sort of makes quite a lot of sense. And then finally, the third most highly concerned about issue was the loss of natural places, with 96% of people concerned about that. And if we take that back to what we were talking about before in terms of how people connect with nature, they want to connect with nature in natural places. So these two are quite connected. We also know that Australians are doing a lot to act to protect nature themselves. And if given the ability to, they're willing to do a lot more. So we measured a range of different behaviours that Australians are either doing or might be willing to do in the future that have a measurable impact on the nature around them. The most common behaviour that Australians are doing, again, connects back to loss of natural places and connects back to spending time in nature. 85% of people are at least sometimes spending time in nature. And we find in terms of I guess like a snowball effect, so people acting for nature more and more, generally spending time in nature is that one thing that gets them inspired to do more later on. So it's a really good sort of stepping stone to get people to do more things in the future. What is really encouraging as well is that 85% of Australians spend time in nature, but that's actually a 15% increase from 2023. So in 2023, it was 70% of Australians who said that they were doing this. 15% increase is a very large increase in a survey of this size. These are some of the other sort of frequent behaviours that Australians were doing for nature. So we had 68% of people who talked with other people about nature, at least sometimes. Of those people who had access to a garden that they had control over, 66% of them were managing that garden for nature, so using it to help protect the biodiversity around them. And of people who had pets, 60% of them were managing those pets for nature. So that's things like keeping cats inside, having their dogs on leashes, so on and so forth. But the main thing I want to point out here is these pink boxes, because what this is showing us is that there's actually a really large amount of people who aren't doing things for nature. Maybe they feel like they can't, maybe there's not the infrastructure there for them to be able to do it, but they're willing to do something for nature. So Australians who aren't doing certain behaviours for nature are still willing to do those things in the future, which is really encouraging. The majority of those who don't act are willing to in the future. And finally, Australians want more action for nature. And luckily, I think Lis is going to be talking to this in a lot more detail in terms of what sort of things Australians want to see. But what we found from the survey is that 96% of Australians, which is the large majority, want to see more action to protect nature in the country. And they're really, really strong in terms of their belief of that. So we know here, a great deal is up 8%. So basically what that means is people who might have been sitting in a some or a lot more category are now shifting to wanting a great deal more action for nature. And that is it from me. Key takeaways: Australians are increasingly relying on peers and experts to learn about nature issues. And Lis will be talking a little bit about trust messages as well, so who could share those messages. Australians are connected to nature. They're concerned about the current and future state of nature. They're willing to do more for nature, and they want to see more action for nature. And that is it from me. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Meg. Next, we'll have Lis Ashby, who's going to look at some of the results that are particularly relevant in the context of the upcoming election, such as influence on voting intentions and support for various policies. Lis is the Policy and Innovation Lead at the Biodiversity Council, where she uses her expertise from 15 years in government to drive positive change for biodiversity policy and regulation at the national level. Thank you, Lis.
Thank you. I would first like to acknowledge that I'm also calling in from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present. So my slides will be slightly different, I guess, to Megan's, in as much as I will be speaking to some of the headline results in the report, but also some of the more fine details that exist within our data related to things like demographics and sort of voting alignment, because of its relevance to the upcoming election and policy direction. So as Meg said, I'd speak about trust in messengers. So a good result for us is that the number one source that is trusted by the Australian community are researchers and scientists, and that's true for all demographics except for the 25 to 34 age group who trust them second to environmental organisations. And environmental organisations are second for almost all demographics, except for the 25 to 34. They're also equal third for the 75 age group plus. So what we're seeing is this interesting story, I guess, around where people are getting their information from over time, with a high level of information gathered from environmental organisations and a high level of trust there, and also researchers and scientists. There's also some interesting results if you dig into it a little bit more. If we look at the farmers, this is the overall result, saying 37% of people trust farmers for information about the natural environment. That's higher if you're aged over 75, if you're based in a rural area, and if you're non-university educated. We also see a difference between men and women. So men are more likely to trust the federal government for information about the natural environment and less likely to trust environmental organisations than women are. In terms of government performance, this might speak to why people are trusting the government less for their information, but there's a sense that the government at both the state and federal levels are not performing well in terms of managing the natural environment. So in 2023, the result was that 33% said that the federal government was doing a good job or an excellent job, and that's down to 24% now this year, 2024. What we see is that there's also reduced trust in parties to protect nature. So what we see is that overall, there's a lot more trust in the Australian Greens to protect nature than some of the other party alignment. This trickiness with these results because it often has some correlation with the party that you feel aligned with, that you think that they'll protect nature more than the others. One of the things that I think that's interesting, though, is that less than 25% have strong trust in any party or candidate to protect nature, and that trust is lower for older age groups. So in general, when you look at the demographic data, it basically shows these linear declines that as you age, your level of trust in anyone, regardless of party, to protect nature decreases over time. In terms of the environment in the broader discourse, we find that the results show that the environment is quite high up in terms of the most important policy issues for Australians. It's number 5. The cost of living is, as expected, very high priority for most people, and that's quite a consistent result across demographics and voting alignment. And then the next 4 issues, housing, healthcare, the economy, and the environment, sort of cluster around that sort of 50 to 55% level. What's interesting, though, is that if you look at swing voters, the environment actually rates equal third with healthcare above the economy. And I think that there's a question about how the degree to which the major parties in this election are fairly silent on natural environment issues, but whether that's actually something that they should be more aware of, given swinging voters in general through these results show high levels of concern than non-swinging voters. So in terms of nature influence on voting intention, you can see there that most people are saying that that nature will have at least a slight influence on their voting intention. That's higher if you're a woman, if you're in the 25 to 44 age group, and if you're university educated. One of the things that is also interesting about this is that we don't really know how this will play out, and it'll be interesting to see after the election in terms of the difference between what people state and how it plays out at the ballot box. But I think it's an issue that the big parties will ignore at their peril, given that a lot of the seats that are in play are in particular areas that have concentrations of people who are aware of environmental issues. And so that's where often we're seeing the Teals or the Greens really talking about those natural environment issues because they're of concern to their communities that are often based around metropolitan centres like Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. In terms of policy support, a result that we quite like from a policy and advocacy point of view is that 95% of those surveys support an increase in the budget for nature. And that's something that we've been pushing for governments to do for some time. So right now, the amount of money spent on on-ground biodiversity is less than 0.1%, and we would like the parties to commit to 1%. And that actually has a very broad support. And in terms of the swing voter result, again, the swing voters are more likely to support much higher spends of above 5% than non-swinging voters. So they're very strongly interested in more money being spent to achieve on-ground biodiversity outcomes. In terms of policy support, what we see is actually a deep amount of support for a whole lot of policy issues. So we have the highest levels of support for strengthening environmental laws and establishing national environmental standards at 75%. The second is regulating logging under national environmental laws at 74%. And the third is the establishment of marine sanctuaries. This varies by age and it varies by voting intention. What we find is that even in those issues that have lower levels of support, still the support is often over 50%. So when we're talking about the two issues that have the lowest levels of outright support, being culling invasive species and establishment of an independent EPA, the level of support is still at 60%. And what you actually see is that there's still very low levels of outright opposition at 8% and 7% respectively. So it's really those people who don't really know enough and are sort of saying they neither support nor oppose. And so they're an audience that might be someone that we can approach and communicate to them what it means and sort of establish their position on those issues. The policy support varies by demographics. One of the interesting things that's shown is actually the people that are under the age of 45 have a lot more opposition for culling invasive species, and the people above 55 have much higher levels of support. And so you have this separation based on age in terms of whether you support that particular action. There's also variation among political parties, but it's actually less divided than you would expect. That for most issues, you're seeing actually very high levels of support, regardless of political affiliation. And so one of the things that I would like to highlight as an example is the establishment of new national parks debate. So this is something we've highlighted in our report because it's very topical in terms of there being a kind of groundswell on social media to oppose the establishment of new national parks. But when you look across people's political alignment, you're actually seeing still clearly above 50% support for those parties that might be considered to be less likely to support environmental action. So, you know, One Nation and the National Party, you're still seeing 61% of those people saying that they support the establishment of new national parks. And this is interesting in terms of where we are in a sort of policy realm, because I think that in terms of how social media is playing out, it's very easy for certain voices to become very loud right now and for it to maybe misrepresent the feelings of the broader community about issues. And that's why I think surveys of this kind are very important, and ensuring that we're actually representing what the majority of people want, which is more action to protect biodiversity and greater amounts of spending on biodiversity and even greater amounts of regulation to protect biodiversity. So thank you. I will throw to Angela, who will have some insights about how we encourage people to act for biodiversity.
Thanks very much, Liz. So Associate Professor Angela Dean is now going to look beyond these findings and ask how we can engage more people in nature and its conservation. Angela is a conservation social scientist at the University of Queensland who is interested in how people experience the natural world and how this shapes their motivation to take action to protect nature. Thanks, Angela.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us online today. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from Meanjin in Brisbane, the home of the Yagara and Turrbal people, but the research that we do is from regions across Australia. So as Meg mentioned at the start in the first presentation, the data from these studies suggests that people overall are generally like nature, are concerned about nature, and are loosely supportive of a bunch of initiatives to protect nature. But that doesn't always mean they are active stewards or active advocates for nature protection. So a lot of my research focuses on how can we stoke this sort of, I guess, latent concern or interest or connection to nature into a more active position. So what we see when we think about images of nature, we think about beautiful places, about wildlife, but what ideally we'd like to see is that people see themselves as active contributors to these places through either active stewardship activities or actively supporting nature conservation initiatives more broadly. So there's a lot of research that says there's a positive association between a sense of feeling connected to nature or spending time in nature and taking action or supporting nature protection actions. So sometimes this leads to those of us in the space saying, oh, this suggests that we just need to get people into nature more, or we need to get them to appreciate that more. But what we do in our research is go, well, what does that actually mean? What if we do that? What's the impact of those things? So the other point I'd like to make before I start jumping into the findings is that it's really important to realise that people are different to us. Those of us who work in the nature conservation space have a range of motivations and experiences, but when we're thinking about trying to engage the broader population in Australia, we need to get out of our perspective bubble and reach a broader range of participants. So often we use things like social research companies to recruit people who are more representative of a typical Australians or other types of people. So one particular study that we're curious in to go, well, what if we get people who aren't overly into nature and we take them into nature and give them an experience, and how does that shape their perspectives about stewardship and nature protection? This was funded by the New South Wales government as part of a Pathways to Strengthening Stewardship project. So what we got is we recruited a bunch of people who indicated that they weren't overly connected to nature. As you know from the survey, people generally say they are. So we wanted that perspective at the end who just went, yeah, nature, whatever. So we got those people and took them for guided nature walks and then interviewed them to get their perspectives. And what we found is that overall, the appreciation for nature in these people is really positive. People got to these beautiful places and went, these places are gorgeous. Oh, I should spend more time in here. This is lovely. It makes me think of when I was a kid. But when we start to talk about stewardship, there was a bunch of things missing. So firstly, there's a lot of externalized responsibility. So they sat there talking about protecting these places, but it wasn't anything to do with them. They would say things like, someone should look after this. And it's a government role, like this is public space. So it's a government thing. It's not a me thing. They also felt that they lacked confidence, that taking action to protect nature was only for people who know about stuff. And they would say to the interviewer or the guided interpreter, oh, they need people like you to look after this place. So they didn't feel there was a role for ordinary people. And thirdly, they don't know what to do. So this notion of going, well, what would I do to protect this place? So often that discussion about personal actions focuses on basic things like following rules, like not littering or not destroying things, rather than active steps to promote restoration or protection. We've got really similar findings with other ecosystems. So one of my PhD students, Dr. Yolanda Waters, did a lot of this work on the Great Barrier Reef and found, again, most people are concerned. They're aware of a range of threats, but they don't feel that the things they can do in everyday life can have an impact on these ecosystems. But they're actually really interested in finding out what they can do. People don't like a sense of powerlessness. We know people are busy and it's not always easy to go, new inspiration, but they're generally receptive to those types of things. So the take-home message number one is that people value nature, but we need to make it really clear what we want people to do. So the second part of our research I'd like to talk about is to go, well, what can we add to nature experiences or daily life experiences that might help inspire more specific actions across the community? So one of the things we look at, we've got a bunch of studies where we look at citizen science experiences, in particular nature-based citizen science. This is a marine-based study, but we've got similar findings from terrestrial studies as well. So when we look at them, nature experiences are a really important reason why someone steps out the door to do a nature-based citizen science program. They say things like, oh, I loved it. It was so impressive. It was amazing. But when we talk about what's flipping the dial for them when they're thinking about action and what they can do, the things that are most salient for inspiring action is actually talking to other people. So people would say things like, I thought I had a general awareness, but this is really more because I'm talking to people, that's the scientists, who are actually living it. Or seeing others with passion and purpose made me feel like I need to start doing something. Or when you're doing the data entry, one of the projects had a lot of data entry, actually seeing the work you do go to use instills a sense of purpose. So this really tells us the take-home message, and we've got other studies I'm happy to share if people are curious, that while nature experience is really important, it's not the only part of an experience that can motivate action. And what we need to do is provide some curation that connects the dots for people from things they care about to actually doing a thing. So another thing that we often do is we provide information, and some of that might be in situ, or some of it might be, like Meg said, through news, or it might be through personal interactions. And to go, well, what should we emphasize when we're communicating about nature protection? So one of the things we do is a bunch of message experiments. Now, the findings from this one are super preliminary, so don't go off and tweeting about them if anyone is still on Twitter. So we would use messages like this one. We'd show this little guy who's super cute and have a story about, like, there's threats, but there's actions, and let's all take action. And a lot of us in the space would look at that and go, oh my goodness, we need to do things. So we also had another message that were focused on places. I'm talking about places being threatened, but there's some things we could do, and here's a call to action message. So these messages were identical, except for the focus on wildlife versus place. What we found, preliminary findings, is that the wildlife focused message actually weakened intentions, and the place-based message actually strengthened intentions to adopt stewardship actions. So again, this is super preliminary. I don't want to tell us to stop talking about wildlife by any means, but I think it's really important to go, the things that we find motivating may not be doing the magic that we want out in the world, and to think about what are the things that are going on when people look at what we're talking about. Another one of the issues we talk about is to go, well, what types of experiences do our messages connect with? So a lot of what we do tries to unpack the relationship between, well, what is it about a nature experience that is associated with action? So this is some data from Healthy Land and Water, which is the NRM group for Southeast Queensland. And this is part of their ecosystem health monitoring program, where we survey more than 3,000 residents of Southeast Queensland every year. So what we find is that using nature, so in this particular piece of data, but it's equivalent across a lot, is that using waterways for social activities or other things like fishing or exercising is associated with more frequent stewardship. But when we look at the things that mediate, or the pathways, what is it that helps that relationship happen? What we see is that the things people that are important mediators of that relationship are things like people being concerned about or feeling that they'd be affected by loss of place. They feel more capable, so we use the word efficacy for that. They feel that there's fewer barriers for them to do things, and they also feel stronger satisfaction with the place. So these place-based appreciation and concern about loss are really important drivers. In contrast, this perception of threats being severe to nature is not a key driver of that pathway. So what does this tell us? A lot of the time, those of us working in the field, and I work with a lot of colleagues who are very focused on researching and understanding and communicating threats to nature. And again, not saying we shouldn't do that, but what's the sweet spot between emphasizing something that's threatened and degraded versus a place that people connect and appreciate? So overall, there's a body of research that suggests people are most motivated to protect things that they already value. So these are nice places or wildlife experiences or elements of nature that they see as positive, that they want to protect and maintain the values of those. When we're talking about a highly degraded ecosystem or loss, it's much harder for people to connect the dots between how they might live their daily lives and what that might become in future. So real places and real experiences that are valued are what are most motivating. So what some of the literature talks about is place at risk. So rather than saying this thing is stuffed or highly degraded or this thing is fine, no problem, we don't want to say that either, but to go, we recognize you love a place or an experience, but there is a risk. So in talking about that risk as rather than present and destructive is on the hill and something we can potentially avert through action. So just a quick wrapping up slide is just linking back to what we know enables people to take action. So this is me mushing together a bunch of psychological theories and frameworks. So we've got things like perceptions of the problem. Is it bad? Will it affect me? But we need to also link the problem to action. There are things that can be done and there are things that I can do. We need people to feel able to do the action, and that's a good thing to do. But there's also a bunch of enabling conditions like well-being and social capital and social connection that are really important. So often when we think about communicating biodiversity challenges, we're often focused on this end of the spectrum, so awareness of the problem, rather than necessarily the specific solutions. So in summary, appreciating nature is useful, but only one part of motivating action. So if we want people to act and help protect nature, we need to invite people to act, to be specific about what we want them to do. And what Meg and BehaviourWorks would do a lot of is about how specific behaviours are much more easy to communicate and motivate than a generic protect nature. People don't really know what that means. We need to connect the dots between what they can do and the benefits that might have for nature, but also understand the context in which people are living and the barriers to action. In addition to those cognitive or procedural knowledge types of dimensions which we talk about, we also need to understand what people care about and love. So they think nature is positive, but they're most motivated to protect things that they can understand, see, and experience. So emphasizing valued places and protecting those is a really important part of that engagement story. I will just mention we have a paper on prioritising community actions, but I won't talk about it. Jump in if you are interested, and I'd like to thank a whole bunch of people involved in this work. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Angela. That was great. But thank you to everyone who's been putting questions into the chat for our speakers, and also to speakers who've been jumping on and already answering some of those questions. So we're going to try to get to a range of questions so that there's a bit of a variety in the discussion next. But I just want to flag that sometimes we have so much interesting discussion during the Q&A session that not all questions get an answer. And we're going to look through those questions, and if there are some really pertinent questions left over, we will put answers on our website. So in the next week, we will put a full recording of this webinar up onto our website, and we'll also include some relevant information from this discussion and some extra answers. So keep a lookout for that. So I'm going to first direct this question to Angela. Anne Reeves has put in a question: how can we raise concern about water management reform, given water's life and healthy wetlands and rivers underpin our well-being? And I'd sort of add to that often to get policy, sort of, this is me riffing on Anne's question, sometimes to get these sort of policy reforms through that might be really important to water reform, we need lots of people to be in support of it, not just the people who happen to live close to that river that might be quite far away from an urban centre. So what do you think? How can we get more people inspired to support and demand action on water reform, Angela?
Thanks very much for that question, Anne and Jana. I often say that water is probably one of the, with some exceptions I'll mention, one of the safest entry points for talking with a range of people about the environment. Those people who have lived through drought, rural people as well as urban people understand the importance of water, both domestic water supply and water for the environment. So I often find it a good sort of entry point to talk about something. So one of those things when I'm engaging or thinking about a process to engage with the group, it's what's the shared value? What do they care about? And then once I've got that, it's how can I start motivating action? There's a couple of points with regard to water. One of the challenges with getting people to do some things is that people are so focused on plastic pollution. So often when we talk about protecting waterways and river systems and marine areas, the default perception of what needs to be done is very plastic oriented. And not to diminish the value of getting rid of that as a source of pollution, it does constrain people's thinking. And if we want them to do something quite different, like engage in riparian restoration or something like that, we need to sort of work with them to make that make sense and relevant for them. Another issue that we're about to start a project on soon actually relates to things like wetlands and restoration. Is generally we assume there's a bunch of social benefits from nature. Overall restoration can provide greater presence of natural places, but in some areas, restoration programs, in particular wetlands, might actually reduce access in some points. So how do people think and view those trade-offs about access? We've done a project, I won't specify the council, but we worked with a local council about restricting beach coastal access for shorebird protection. But what we did as part of that recommendation was create a new point of access to replace the lost one and emphasize continued access, but in a slightly shifted area, which seemed to work quite well. The other area about water management is some water issues are high conflict areas, so Murray-Darling Basin, if anyone works on that. A lot of our messages or information about engaging with people don't always apply in those situations where there's a high level of conflict. If you've got one of those situations, you need much more intensive engagement and a whole bunch of things there. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thanks, Angela. So this is a question from Imogen Ebsworth, who's from the Invasive Species Council. So I'm not sure whether Meg or Lis will want to take it. So start flapping your hands vigorously if you really want this one. But Imogen's asked about the people who say that they care and they want to do more. How confident are we that they connect that through to actually voting intentions and voting for people who are championing nature conservation?
I think that it's difficult for us to make that link. So I think that when this is something that Meg can speak to more, but when we look at actions that people take for nature, advocating for nature, I believe would fit within that. That would be the action that would capture things like voting or campaigning or protesting. But of course, we always have these issues with voting intention. I think that it's a bit rubbery, and of course, there's the proportion of people who haven't made their mind up a week out from the election, and that's where, you have all these people on the campaign trails trying to get those people's vote based on sort of, more recent things and avoid gaffes and that kind of thing. So I think that it's something, we have to kind of look retrospectively after elections to really understand how that played out. And I think a lot of it is a crystal ball. I mean, whenever you're looking at, the pundits sort of talking about who's going to win and what, voting, how voting's going to change based on a particular debate outcome or someone tripping over or saying the wrong thing, all of that is very speculative and crystal ball gazing. So I think what we would emphasize is that there's a whole lot of concern within the community and there's a whole lot of care for the environment. And I think there's an opportunity to sort of activate that in different ways, whether it's people undertaking behaviours individually, as Ange talked about, or whether that's something that goes to bigger sort of political decisions.
Thanks, Liz. I'll move on to the next question so we can get through more. So I've got quite a long question from Warwick Jordan, who lives in Lake Macquarie, and I'm going to summarise it because it's quite long. But I noticed that Balaji further down also said that he's got a similar kind of question. So it really comes down to in where he lives in the Lake Macquarie area, and I think this is probably a question for Angela. In the bushland that's there, he sees a lot of large numbers of younger bush users who are more in the sort of trail, using the bush for trail biking, four-wheel driving, and things like that. He says on the whole, they're pretty responsible, but it's a bit different to the, bushwalking concern for nature kind of group. So how important are these? What do we see as where these people fit in the sort of Venn diagram of people being concerned for nature, these very active users of the bush?
Thanks for those questions. What we see is that actually a whole diverse range of nature users are motivated potentially to engage in protection. So when we look at studies looking at associations between nature use and stewardship, we see strong relationships. So it's not just a sort of, I guess, a traditional bushwalker type of nature use like going bird watching, but a whole bunch of other uses, including extractive processes like fishing or other types of boating, exercise, picnics with family. So I guess it's really important to realise a whole diverse range of types of nature user are motivated to potentially engage in stewardship. In terms of the data on four-wheel drivers, we've got some data on that we haven't dug into. I should have a look. But a lot of the data about, I guess, these more extractive or higher impact, what might be higher impact activities, a lot of that data actually comes from the US. So with hunting in particular, where the demographics are a little bit different. But overall, internationally, the data says these groups are more willing and interested in protecting nature. The challenge is how they present the issues they care about aren't always the same flavour as what we are used to communicating or seeing. So this, I would say, makes it really careful when we develop communication products or engagement processes to use language that doesn't necessarily alienate that group. So, for example, with the dog walker study, which again has an impact on shorebirds in those regions, we were really careful not to recommend language like, you guys are bad. Obviously, no one actually says that, but to really avoid that flavour and to go, this is a special place for you, and we want to make it a special place for everyone. And that language about how can we broaden the specialness of this place that you enjoy and that others want to enjoy, and maybe our animals as well. So I think the language, if we start, so that conversation about impact and reducing impact can easily tip into an us and them type of situation. So often it's really careful. It's challenging though, because I work with ecologists who go, but this activity is wrecking stuff. But I can't go out and lead with that as my first conversational topic because that's going to turn people off. So connecting those dots with my biophysical colleagues, scientists and practitioners as well, is really important to help not alienate that group in our process of change. You're muted, Yana.
Sorry, I had to open a noisy window because I was perspiring into a pool of sweat in Brisbane. So Meg, a question for you from Bob Mackinson. So this sort of goes partly also to how we chose to ask the questions we did in terms of the wording. Bob's raised very pertinent point that in engaging the community with biodiversity issues, we often sort of deal with a bit of a plant blindness. Everyone talks about wildlife and less about plants. And in some of our questions, I know we use the word wildlife and not plants and animals, or biodiversity more generally. So I'll just let you respond to that, and how we can overcome this thing, given that 2/3 of our threatened species are plants. There's actually a lot more threatened plants than there are animals.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Bob, and I think definitely something like a lesson we can learn for the next survey as well. I think so. There are a few questions where we put in plants and animals, but thinking about that now, people's sort of the attention they pay tends to go to animals over plants, as you pointed out. So maybe that's something in the future that we should separate out. And also in terms of the research, there tends to be a lot more research on people's connection to animals more than there is on people's connection to plants. Part of that is because, as I was saying before, we tend to use our wildlife species as more of an iconic thing that we have pride in, but there's definitely scope for that to also be part of the unique plants that we have as well. There's not a sort of set answer to this, but I guess, yeah, my takeaway is that he makes a really good point, and hopefully that's something we can bring into future surveys.
Thanks very much, Meg. Okay, I have a question for Lis, and it might be her personal opinion, really. But so Jeff Dorrit has pointed out, as I think probably every person on this call has probably been thinking, we are aware there's a lot of concern for nature amongst a majority of people in the community. Why are the major parties and key people campaigning this election not talking about the environment? Is it an Achilles heel for them? Are they deliberately not talking about it? What are your thoughts?
I think they're deliberately not talking about it.
Because?
Well, Labor came in strong in the 2022 election, making various commitments, and they released their nature positive plan that said they were going to do a whole lot of things, and in the main they haven't lived up to those commitments. And then of course they've it's the actions that they've taken have been in the opposite direction based on vested interest groups. So whether that's the WA mining lobby or the Tasmanian salmon farming companies. And so I think that actually isn't a particularly good look, because it's not a look of a well-studied sort of policy outcome or something reflective of broader community concern. And so I think that it's something. I can tell you that some of the major environment groups are actually asking the major parties what their policy positions are, and we are getting more detailed responses from some of the teals, to be honest with you, in terms of them having thought about it and wanting to state publicly what they would be willing to commit to. I don't know, Deanna, is that enough of an answer?
I think so, especially given the time. So thanks very much, Liz. There is a question from Kath Falco that I'm just going to give a short answer to. Kath has raised the point that how do we use these results, the fact that there is concern for the environment, to get to a situation where when we get to a disaster like a major bushfire, it's not all humans first and no concern for wildlife. And so to that, I'm going to flag that Professor John Wojnarski from Charlestown University has actually put a lot of thinking on that, and we could probably include a link when we have this up on our page, and really promoting the idea that it's not humans or nature. We can, as they say, walk and chew gum at the same time. We could have plans and strategies in place so that when disasters happen, we can also respond appropriately to nature. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have left for questions. So but I do want to flag one thing for everyone before we wrap up. And it's another important piece of work we're doing that I think is really important right now. So we've seen from the concern survey that many people say that they would take nature into account in their voting decisions. But we appreciate that it can be really hard to know what the details of all the different parties' policies are and to spend the time to review them. So to assist people in their decision making, we have a panel of experts, biodiversity counsellors from 6 universities who represent a range of environmental science, law, policy, Indigenous backgrounds, and they are going to do an assessment of the policy commitments of the key parties and candidates, so including, incumbent teals and people, some of the independents that have a very good likelihood of getting up. Clearly, we can't do every single independent in every electorate, but we'll be targeted. And so we'll make that assessment available to help people sort of see through and have a bit of a fair idea of what people are really offering. So keep an eye out for that in coming weeks. So as I said, we are going to put a webinar, the recording of this up on our website in the coming week. We will send a copy out to everyone who's attended. If you found this helpful or useful and you think you have colleagues or friends who didn't come and that would be interested in this, do please share it with them. That helps us get the word out. One of the people in the question said, how do we get the word out about these kinds of findings? And partly people like yourselves who come to these, this is part of that process. And if you can help us spread the word, that's fantastic. So thank you to our speakers, Meghan, Lis and Angela, and to all of you for attending and for your questions and interest in this. So thanks for coming.